There are many characters in this Mushroom Kingdom universe, and we've seen that it's not just about Mario, but he also has some amazing friends. The enemies are pretty cool too, but there's a small group of these characters who've proven to do well by themselves as the main character, like Luigi and Yoshi, even Wario, but none have had quite the solo success as Donkey Kong. He's had a lot of growth in a small amount of time, from the villain to the hero, but it seems that the character and world building of Donkey Kong had peaked in the 90s, and then went into this rhythm bongo controller phase, only to eventually just lean into the nostalgia of the better DK games of the past. Let's look beyond the gameplay a bit and shine a light on the game's audio, and see how the music of Donkey Kong helped Nintendo dominate the video game market. It seems that over the past decade, Donkey Kong has been resorted back to just being the rival side character opposite of Wario, but he's proven to be a lot more than that. Now I could really make this into a whole rise and rise again, fall again video type of thing, but I really wanted to focus on the sound design for Donkey Kong. Because sound is important, and like with any other form of visual media, the sound is just as important as the writing, lighting, direction, etc. And it helps to paint a complete picture. So let's get into 1980s DK with the original Donkey Kong. So the legendary, iconic video game designer Shigeru Miyamoto was in charge to develop a hit arcade game to not only rival the 1980 hit Pac-Man, but something that could break into the North American market in general. Not only would Nintendo succeed, but they would use 1981 Donkey Kong's success to begin their domination of the whole video game market through the 90s. You never forget the design and the little tunes embedded into it. For one, you have that first cutscene tune that plays when DK first climbs up the ladder. This was actually a variation of a piece taken from the theme song of a cop drama series from the 50s called Dragnet. It's a popular instrumental that's been used to give a slight ominous, mysterious tone of impending doom. Very 50s film noir-like, and in the 80s, this was translated into an Atari video game sound. Donkey Kong was the first video game to do this, but you could also find the tune in Pitfall during the death sequence, and on a game called Roadrunner. This tune was arranged for the game by the composer Yukio Kaneoka. Also an electronic engineer and sound designer, he worked with Nintendo in the 80s and designed sound drivers for the Famicom and NES. Kaneoka also composed the music for 1982's Donkey Kong Jr., where the sound and graphics were praised for being exceptionally arcade-like. Now Donkey Kong 3, which came out the following year, was composed by Hirokazu Tanaka. Tanaka had the same kind of background as Kaneoka, and also worked on the original Donkey Kong by providing the sound effects for Mario's footsteps and jumps. In DK3, he designed the sound effects and was the composer. But this was only the beginning. While composing more of Nintendo's 8 and 16-bit video game music over time, including that of Earthbound, Metroid, and even Pokemon, Tanaka is known as a pioneer of chiptune music, and even has the nickname Chip Tanaka. Donkey Kong would be rebooted entirely a decade later with the Donkey Kong Country series. Inspired by Super Mario's side-scrollers, this was Donkey Kong's very own unique platform game, and it came out fall of 1994 to hold a new record for a fastest-selling video game. The British video game developers Nintendo had entrusted to create this game, Rare, would use the capabilities of the Super Nintendo to its full potential by using pre-rendered 3D graphics. The Donkey Kong Country games, at least the first two of them, still hold up very well, but another big part of why DKC was also iconic was its sound and music composition. Now Rare, or Rareware, back then, was a second-party developer for Nintendo after Nintendo bought a 49% stake in their company, now owned by Microsoft. But in the 90s, they've developed some of the most memorable 90s games, including Banjo-Kazooie. But on Donkey Kong Country, most of the soundtrack was composed by Rare's in-house composer, David Wise. Since he knew about how Rare was pushing the limits with the graphics, Wise wanted to also push the limits of the audio and make something that could really accommodate these new graphics. The music mixed natural environmental sounds with melodies and percussion accompanies to give you an immersive feel for where you were, whether it be a jungle, a cave, or underwater. Wise has called his favorite track, and the game's biggest technological accomplishments in regards to the audio, the mesmerizing aquatic ambience. The title is straight to the point, and aquatic ambience is a great example of the level of work put into DKC's detail. Then you also have the upbeat DK Island Swing, which is an iconic Donkey Kong track that kind of exemplifies the vibe of the whole series. There was a lot of influences with the music, and with a track like DK Island Swing, you can notice a 1940s jazzy swing style, which is something Wise was specifically going for. But he was using a lot of synthesizer as well, and you can hear a lot of 80s rock and synth influence in the music. King K. Rool's theme was influenced by Iron Maiden. There's even some late 80s hip-hop influence that can especially be heard in the theme song. They even animated DK with a boombox. A woman also working for Rare at the time named Evelyn Fisher composed some of the music as well, including the tune you hear while traveling through the map. Evelyn just so happened to also voice the main character for Rare's Perfect Dark as well. I just thought that was interesting. The music of DKC was praised right along with the gameplay, and Nintendo really owed a lot to the success of the game and all of Rare's hard work. Nintendo would entrust Rare with all of Donkey Kong's games going forward until, of course, Rare was bought out by Microsoft. Now, as with any hit video game, sequels and spin-off versions would come out. In 1995, Donkey Kong Land for the Game Boy came out, and Rare had started developing it before Country came out, and they wanted it to be an original game and not just a tiny port of Donkey Kong Country. David Wise and another Rare composer wanted to figure out how to convert the Donkey Kong Country soundtrack to the Game Boy's sound chip. And they were successful, because although the quality was so much lower than the Super Nintendo, they still were able to make a good little spin-off game. Rare was really busy in the 90s, because in the same year that Donkey Kong Land came out, Nintendo released the second best-selling game of the year, Diddy's Kong Quest, the acclaimed sequel to Donkey Kong Country. David Wise returned to compose all the music, and this time an official soundtrack was released. The music for Diddy's Conquest remained similar to its predecessor, as it had 1980s influences with lots of synthesizer, but it had a different feel to it, probably to accommodate all these brand new levels and the fact that they aren't on DK Island anymore, they're in Kremlin territory now. Also, given that it was all made by the same composer, it just had a different vibe. For the most part, it was catchy and had a comical tone, but still had tracks you could just listen to for hours. Stickerbush Symphony had received particular critical acclaim for being melancholic and reflective, while still being up-tempo enough to be a bop. A year later, in 1996, Donkey Kong Land 2 came out. And while this one was just a conversion of Donkey Kong Country 2, the music was converted by Grant Kirkhope. In 1996, Kirkhope was just getting started, but later on he would be known to compose the music for Banjo-Kazooie and DK64. That same year, a new Donkey Kong Country game would come out for the Super Nintendo, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Now, the game once again was praised for its visuals and gameplay, but this time the soundtrack would get mixed opinions. Critics would suggest that it was an impressive quality effort on the music, but compared to the other Donkey Kong Country games, the third soundtrack stood out the least. The soundtrack wasn't made by David Wise this time, but rather Evelyn Fisher, the other composer who worked on the original Donkey Kong Country. When a port of the game was eventually released on Game Boy Advance in 2005, David Wise actually made a new soundtrack for it. Not to disregard the work his colleague already worked on, but they wanted to have both soundtracks on the GBA port. Due to cartridge size and time restraints, they couldn't include everyone's music. fall of 1997, the third Donkey Kong Land game comes out, but it's a brand new game featuring Dixie and her cousin. Donkey Kong himself doesn't actually make an appearance, but it was praised for brilliantly designed levels and impressive visuals. I guess impressive for a Game Boy game. Also, like with the other Donkey Kong Land games, it would use a smaller compressed version of the Donkey Kong soundtrack it's based on. By now, in 1997, the Nintendo 64 was out, and Diddy Kong Racing came out that holiday season. David Wise would actually return to do the music. The soundtrack was noted for being upbeat and catchy with a note of silliness, which is Wise's style. He released the soundtrack a few months later, and interestingly enough, the CD for Diddy Kong Racing was shaped as Diddy's head, like actually shaped weird to the point where it couldn't be played on most CD players. Apparently Yoshi's Story did this same thing with their soundtrack as well. Rare was still working on that masterpiece, Banjo-Kazooie, so them coming out with this racing game as something DK related to have for the holidays made sense. People seem to have liked it when it first came out, but eventually I rented it from Blockbuster and tried it out and I wasn't impressed. So a year later, for holiday 1998, Rare released Banjo-Kazooie. But in holiday 1999, we got Donkey Kong 64. This would be Rare's final Donkey Kong game, and I'd say it was a great game to end with. Rare started making it in 1997, right after the Donkey Kong Country trilogy wrapped up. Something DK Country related for the next-gen console, the N64. Of course, this ended up being one of the N64's best-selling platform games, and the music was composed by Grant Kirkhope, known for the music of Banjo-Kazooie. DK64 was a very musical game. Each playable character had their own special instrument, and it was kinda like they were all in a band or something, looking like the Banana Splits. No pun actually really intended. Outside of winning an award for Best Music and Best Sound in the 1999 Nintendo Power Awards, IGN would compare it with Banjo-Kazooie, saying the music wasn't as clever, but still delivered a variety of moods and fit the settings. Well, that was the point. That's the Donkey Kong Country style of music, different melodies for different areas. As an extension of the Donkey Kong Country universe, I think Grant Kirkhope did just fine, doing what David Wise did years earlier in terms of atmosphere. He would even make a remix of the Jungle Japes theme from the original. But it's definitely not the same. Kirkhope just has his own style, and it might feel more like Banjo-Kazooie music than Donkey Kong Country music. Now, looking into the opening music, the DK rap, very humorous, lighthearted, and corny. Some people loved it. Some hated it. A GamePro.com review would call it very funny, but lowbrow. I think that sums it up. Rare is known for being very goofy, and the DK rap was right on brand. Nintendo of America actually held a contest to see who could make a better DK rap. Winners would get a DK64 bundle and have their rap posted on the official Donkey Kong site. Grant Kirkhope's website gave us some more insights on the production of the music, and regarding the DK rap, he said it was supposed to be a joke, not a serious attempt at a rap song, and that he's gotten quite a bit of flack for that piece over the years. Kirkhope also reveals that he provided Donkey Kong's voice.
Banana.
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 Nice. Very nice.
Meant to just be used as a sample voice, he sent Nintendo the samples and they ended up using them in the finished game.
Okay.
Kirkhope had also supplied the voice for Mumbo Jumbo and the Jinjos for the Banjo-Kazooie games, and it might have seemed like it would have just been a one-time thing, voicing Donkey Kong for DK64, but Kirkhope actually became a reoccurring voice for DK throughout the 2000s, notably in Donkey Konga and the Game Boy Advance versions of Donkey Kong Country. But outside that one little joke track he did, the DK64 soundtrack and overall quality of the audio stood out. And it did feature Dolby surround sound as well, so DK64 was just as immersive, large, and goofy as it could have possibly been. DK64 would mark the end of a whole era of Donkey Kong, and sadly, this is where the IP peaks. As we came into the 2000s, it was all about the new GameCube console. There were more plans for Donkey Kong in the future, like a new racing game, but the partnership Nintendo had with Rare ended in 2002. So Nintendo was pretty much on their own now when it came to developing any more games starring DK. Shouldn't be a problem, right? I mean, it's their character, but it took them a few years to figure out what they were going to do with him. But being as innovative as Nintendo is, they built a rhythm game around him called Donkey Konga. Japan would get a hold of this before anyone in 2003, while the rest of the world got it holiday 2004. Rhythm games had been popular in Japan for years already, but in the West, it started blowing up in the late 90s to mid 2000s with games like Guitar Hero and Dance Dance Revolution. It became custom for console rhythm games to be played with a special controller in the shape of an instrument, meant to make the game more immersive and real, I guess. And Donkey Konga came with a pair of little bongo drums. Nintendo had neighboring video game company Namco develop this for them, which makes sense because Namco is known for making games for the arcade market, like Tekken, Ridge Racer, and of course Pac-Man. The team Nintendo was working with specifically was the same one over the Taiko no Tatsujin, Master of the Drums franchise. Donkey Konga was meant to have the feel and appeal of an arcade game. It was like the mix of a dancing game with Guitar Hero in the face of a well-known character. Donkey Konga received generally favorable reviews, and given the time it came out in, it was a smart move because these types of games were in style. 90s style platform games, like the games Donkey Kong had become known for, were actually dropping in popularity. The music being used in the Donkey Konga games were a lot of Nintendo's own music and well-known rock and pop songs like We Will Rock You. Other than that, the original music and sound effects were done by Namco's composer and sound designer Junko Ozawa. Donkey Konga 2 would come out in 2005, again with Japan getting it first, and it got a T rating in North America for having songs with certain lyrics. Other regions seemed to be more careful with the songs they included, but it's not like North America had the best song list or anything. It was like this random list of American music that they made for us. It's kind of funny. Again, this whole concept was made for arcades, ideally with Japanese music. And funny enough, there was a Donkey Konga 3 that released in 2005, but only in Japan. But 2005 gave us a better worldwide Donkey Kong game. Donkey Kong Jungle Beat would go back to some of DK's jungle platforming roots, while using the DK bongos as the controls. With actual levels, visuals, and bosses to fight, this would be the first major DK game since DK64. And this was the first time Nintendo had to develop their own Donkey Kong game since Donkey Kong 3 in the 80s. Japanese music composer and orchestrator Mahito Yokota started working for Nintendo around this time and would compose Jungle Beat's music. He would go on to work on music for Twilight Princess, Super Mario Galaxy, and more. But as his first project for Nintendo, Yokota wanted Jungle Beat's soundtrack to synchronize with the gameplay, similar to how the music would flow in Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Jungle Beat was received generally favorable, reaching new audiences and having appeal to more hardcore gamers, but it was also an important stepping stone for the production of Super Mario Galaxy that came out in 2007. Now on the handheld front of things, Donkey Kong had a game much more lighthearted and casual called DK King of Swing in 2005, made for the Game Boy Advance. An obvious step back from the 3D rendered graphics of Donkey Kong Country, it was another example of Nintendo attempting something that's both unique and familiar at the same time. In 2007, a more visually developed looking sequel to this would come out for the DS called Jungle Climber. Entertainment value and visuals seem to be more important in this era of handheld gaming than the music, so it seems the music in these games kind of take a back seat. And Nintendo was once again using a third party to develop their Donkey Kong games. The music in a game usually depends on who the developing studio uses. for their music. So in this case, a composer named Takashi Konga would lead the music in both handheld games. They would also be the composer of the main Donkey Kong game for the Wii called Barrel Blast. It was finally another racing game featuring Donkey Kong characters, and it was supposed to once again use the DK bongos as controls, but it didn't, as it was delayed. It was essentially a delayed GameCube game released as a Wii title and got negative reviews, with the same type of music King of Swing and Jungle Climber had. There would be no more Donkey Kong games for 3 years, so outside of Donkey Kong entering the arcade scene and making Nintendo's version of Guitar Hero for the West, I'd say Donkey Kong as a brand took a steep decline in the 2000s. But Donkey Kong had somewhat of a literal reboot in the 2010s with Donkey Kong Country Returns. This was developed by Retro Studios, the studio that had already worked with Nintendo before on developing their Metroid Prime games. The game also had the composer for said Metroid Prime games, Nintendo's own video game musician, Kenji Yamamoto, who had also made music for Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! So Nintendo put a lot of things into this game that would work, including the nostalgia of Donkey Kong Country and the 3D side-scrolling thing that was key in Jungle Beat and the OG Country games. Donkey Kong Country Returns was a commercial success, and its music was mostly rearrangements of tracks from the original Donkey Kong Country. The president of Nintendo himself wanted this, as he knew that Donkey Kong Country's music was a large part of its appeal, and he wanted everyone to handle it with care. Retro Studios and Yamamoto would focus on what the bosses at Nintendo felt made Donkey Kong Country's music so iconic, and since the DKC soundtrack is actually quite 80s sounding, they needed to modernize it. At this point, the mastermind behind the original music, David Wise, was unable to contribute. Wise had actually left Rare in 2009 because he didn't like the company's direction under Microsoft. Well, I don't think any of us did. But David Wise would connect with the CEO of Retro Studios and stay in contact with them just in case they wanted to make a sequel. Wise felt that Yamamoto did a quote, wonderful job rearranging his past work, though if it were him, he would have relied more on new compositions than past material. Well, Nintendo didn't have Wise for the production of DKC Returns, so they were too afraid to make new music because they knew David Wise's music was the best for Donkey Kong, and they didn't want to hurt the legacy of the series by producing weaker music. When you don't know the answers to the test, literally the best you can do is copy the answers from someone who does, and that's what Nintendo was doing with Donkey Kong. Well, by golly, like some miracle, the GOAT of Donkey Kong music came back to compose another DK game with 2014's Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. As David Wise would compose most of the soundtrack, another team led by Kenji Yamamoto would provide any additional music. The praise of this game would be directed at the level design, gameplay, and the soundtrack, just like in the good old days. So with a successful revival reboot of sorts, and the return of several key ingredients, it looks like Nintendo finally redeemed itself from its lack of quality Donkey Kong. However, Tropical Freeze is the last Donkey Kong game we've gotten, and years have already gone by, so it's hard to see how and when DK would get his own game again. In recent years, he's gone back to being Mario's ally and rival, just another character in a game full of characters. So I'd say the rise of Donkey Kong was in the 90s, while the sharp decline was in the 2000s, and I'm sure the decline of platform games in general had something to do with this, but it was also Nintendo losing one of the best developing partners they ever had, and not knowing how to follow up with their own character. But in the 2010s, DK slowly rose again through nostalgia and the need to recreate something that was great. And now, just like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, and Banjo-Kazooie, the future of their solo careers is a huge question mark. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more random nostalgia and interesting coincidences surrounding said nostalgia. See ya!